This is an extract from the book The Age of Responsibility, CSR 2.0 and the New DNA of Business by Wayne Visser, read by the author. The failure of CSR. But I am getting ahead of myself. First, let me say what I understand by CSR. I take CSR to stand for corporate sustainability and responsibility, rather than corporate social responsibility, but feel free to use whichever proxy label you are most comfortable with. My definition is as follows. CSR is the way in which business consistently creates shared value in society through economic development, good governance, stakeholder responsiveness, and environmental improvement. Put another way, CSR is an integrated, systemic approach by business that builds rather than erodes or destroys economic, social, human, and natural capital. Given this understanding, my usual starting point for any discussion on CSR is to argue that it has failed. I will provide the data and arguments to back up this audacious claim in the paragraphs, pages, and chapters to follow. But the logic is simple and compelling. A doctor judges his or her success by whether the patient is getting better, healthier, or worse, sicker. Similarly, we should judge the success of CSR by whether communities and ecosystems are getting better or worse. And while at the micro level, in terms of specific CSR projects and practices, we can show many improvements, at the macro level, almost every indicator of our social, environmental, and ethical health is in decline. I'm not alone in my assessment. Indeed, Paul Hawken stated in The Ecology of Commerce in 1993 that if every company on the planet were to adopt the best environmental practice of the leading companies, the world would still be moving towards sure degradation and collapse. Unfortunately, this is still true nearly 20 years later. Jeffrey Hollander, co-founder and former CEO of Seventh Generation, agrees, saying, "I believe that the vast majority of companies fail to be good corporate citizens, Seventh Generation included. Most sustainability and corporate responsibility programs are about being less bad rather than good. They are about selective and compartmentalized programs rather than holistic and systemic change." In fact, there is no shortage of critics of CSR. For example, in 2004, Christian Aid issued a report called Behind the Mask, The Real Face of CSR, in which they argue that CSR is completely inadequate as a response to the sometimes devastating impact that multinationals can have in an ever more globalized world, and it is actually used to mask that impact. A more recent example is an article in the Wall Street Journal, 23rd of August 2010, called The Case Against Corporate Social Responsibility, which claims that the idea that companies have a responsibility to act in the public interest and will profit from doing so is fundamentally flawed. This is not the place to deconstruct these polemics. Suffice to say that they raise some of the same concerns I have, especially around the limits of voluntary action and the misdirection that CSR sometimes represents. But I also disagree with many of their propositions, such as the notion that CSR is always a deliberate strategy to mislead, or that government regulation is the only solution to social and environmental problems. Be that as it may, there are a number of ways to respond to my assertion that CSR has failed. One is to disagree with the facts and to suggest that things are getting better, not worse, as do the likes of Bjorn Lomborg in his Skeptical Environmentalist of 2001. That is his and your prerogative. However, I find the evidence, some of which is presented below and which is widely available from credible sources like the United Nations, both compelling and convincing. Second, you might argue that solving these complex social and ethical and environmental problems is not the mandate of CSR, nor within its capacity to achieve. My response is that while business certainly cannot tackle our global challenges alone, unless CSR is actually about solving the problems and reversing the negative trends, then what is the point? CSR then has become little more than an altruistic conscience easer at best, a manipulative image management tool at worst. My approach, and the essence of this book, is to say that while CSR as it has been practiced in the past has failed, that doesn't mean that a different kind of CSR, one that addresses its limitations and reforms its nature, is destined to fail in the future. Hence, the first part of the book is about where we have gotten to with CSR to date, through the ages of greed, philanthropy, marketing, and management, using defensive, charitable, promotional, and strategic CSR approaches, respectively. The second part of the book then goes on to explore what CSR could, and in my view should, be in the age of responsibility, namely systemic or radical CSR, which I also call CSR 2.0. Along the way, I cite many best practice case studies, none of which are fully practicing systemic CSR, but all of which have pieces of the puzzle that can instruct and inspire.